The title of the story is The Mountain Path. In a small town near big mountains, there lived a young boy named George. His family didn't have much, but he was filled with big dreams and strong determination. George's biggest dream was to climb the highest mountain in the area, called Mount Liberty. To others, it was just a far-off snowy peak, but to George, it meant greatness. George loved talking about his dream, but most people just laughed. "It's too high," they'd say. "You're too young, George." Even his friends didn't think he could do it. But George wasn't one to give up. One day, an old mountain climber named Benjamin came back to town. He was famous for climbing Mount Liberty years ago. George ran up to him and asked for advice. Benjamin listened carefully to George's story, then looked him in the eye and said, "Mount Liberty is no easy climb. It will test your mind, body, and heart. But if you truly want it, train every day and never forget why you're doing it." George took Benjamin's words seriously. Every day after school, he trained hard. He ran up hills, lifted heavy rocks, and read about mountain climbing. Some days he wanted to quit, especially when he was sore and tired. But he remembered Benjamin's advice and kept going. Finally, after a whole year of training, George felt ready. He told Benjamin, who smiled and handed him an old map of Mount Liberty. "This will help you," he said, "but remember, let your heart be your guide." On the day of his climb, George stood at the base of Mount Liberty, looking up at the tall mountain. The climb was much harder than he expected. The paths were steep, the air got thin, and cold winds blew around him. Sometimes he thought about turning back. He remembered his family's worried faces, the laughter of his friends, and the doubts from the townspeople. But he also remembered Benjamin's advice and his own promise to reach the top. As George climbed higher, he felt very alone at times. But each time he wanted to stop, he found a little more strength. He rested when he needed to and kept going when he could. Slowly but surely, George moved up the mountain even when his body was tired. After days of climbing, George finally reached the summit. Standing on top of Mount Liberty, looking out over the world below, he felt proud and happy. All the hard work, the training, and the doubts disappeared. George knew now that he could do anything he set his mind to. When he returned to town, George was welcomed as a hero. People looked at him with pride and respect. His friends, who had once doubted him, now saw him as an inspiration. But to George, the best reward was knowing what he was capable of. Benjamin came to congratulate him and said, "You did it, George. You reached the summit. But remember, the greatest mountain you climbed was the one within yourself. Never forget what you learned on your journey." From that day on, George was known as the boy who conquered the mountain. He continued to dream big and shared his story with anyone who would listen. He reminded everyone that no matter how hard the path, if they believed in themselves and took one step at a time, they could climb any mountain.